A ruthless alpha king at the peak of his $15 billion empire swiped away his wife's message to check a stock notification, never realizing he was dismissing his only chance to hear goodbye before she vanished with his unborn heir. Emily Milner stood in the shadows of the Manhattan penthouse, her crimson suit a slash of defiance against the cold white marble that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was nearly midnight, and James still hadn't acknowledged her presence. 6 years. 6 years of a marriage that had begun as a political alliance between powerful werewolf packs and dissolved into something worse than hatred, polite, expensive indifference. She pressed her palm against her stomach, feeling the secret that had been living there for 12 weeks. A baby. Their baby. The heir to the Alpha King's throne and fortune. The news that should have made her heart soar instead sat lodged in her throat like broken glass. Emily had planned it perfectly. She wore the emerald dress James had once said brought out her eyes. Back when he still noticed things like that. Back before she understood that compliment had probably come from Victoria's notes on appropriate spouse management. She'd made reservations at Oriole, his favorite restaurant, the one where they'd had their first official date after the pack elders announced their engagement. She'd even practiced the words in front of the bathroom mirror until they sounded natural instead of desperate. "James, I have something wonderful to tell you. We're going to have a baby." But James never made it to dinner. His phone had erupted with alerts at 6:47 p.m., some crisis in the Singapore branch that required his immediate attention. The reservation went unused. Emily ate leftover Thai food alone at the kitchen island while her husband's voice carried from his study, sharp and commanding, tearing apart some executives' quarterly performance. Before we continue, I've noticed that many of you enjoy watching my videos but haven't subscribed yet. Please help support and grow this channel by liking the video, dropping a comment, and subscribing if you enjoy the stories. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to the story. She tried again on Tuesday morning. James emerged from his bedroom at 5:53 a.m., already dressed, his hair still damp from the shower. Emily intercepted him at the coffee maker, her heart hammering against her ribs. "James, can we talk before you leave?" "It's about." "Emily, I have exactly 12 minutes before the car arrives." He didn't look at her, just took the coffee she'd prepared and added his usual single pump of creamer with mechanical precision. "Victoria has my morning blocked with back-to-back calls until the London markets close. Can it wait?" It had already waited 12 weeks. But Emily nodded, because that's what she'd learned to do. That's what invisible queens did. They waited. By Wednesday, Emily had stopped trying to create the perfect moment. She would simply tell him. No romance, no carefully chosen words. Just the truth, delivered plainly in the 30 seconds between his arrival home and his disappearance into work. James walked through the door at 11:19 p.m., Victoria half a step behind him as always, her tablet glowing like a third presence in their marriage. Emily stood in the foyer, having positioned herself there 20 minutes earlier. She'd changed into jeans and a simple sweater. She was done performing. "James, I need to tell you something important." He stopped, his hand already reaching for his phone as it buzzed. "I'm listening," he said, but his eyes were tracking the notification scrolling across the screen. Victoria stood there with that patient, professional expression, the one that said she'd wait as long as necessary because she understood his world in ways his wife apparently didn't. "We're going to have a baby." The words dropped into the space between them like stones into still water. Emily watched James's face, searching for something, surprise, joy, concern, anything that proved she was more than background noise in his empire. James looked up from his phone. For exactly 2 seconds, his eyes met hers, and Emily saw something flicker there. Confusion, maybe, or just annoyance at being interrupted. He started, then his phone erupted with an incoming call. The screen lit up. Tokyo office. Urgent. "Emily, I need to take this." The Nakamura deal is falling apart. He pressed the phone to his ear, already moving past her toward his study. Victoria, bring the contract files. Victoria followed, her heels clicking a sympathetic rhythm as she passed Emily. Congratulations, she whispered, and somehow that made it worse, that the assistant acknowledged the moment more than the husband, the Alpha King more concerned with deals than dynasties. Emily stood alone in the foyer, her hand pressed against her stomach where their daughter was growing, surrounded by millions of dollars of art and architecture that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. She had just told her husband they were having a baby, and he had walked away to answer a phone call. She was invisible. She had always been invisible, and their child would be raised by a ghost if Emily didn't find the courage to become real again. Emily sat on the edge of the bathtub at 12:43 a.m., her phone clutched in both hands like a lifeline to a version of herself she'd almost forgotten existed. For floors below, she could hear the faint murmur of James's voice through the ventilation system, that distinctive cadence he used when he was commanding a room, sharp, decisive, utterly confident. He was on another video call with executives in some distant time zone where the sun was already up and people were pretending his brilliance justified his cruelty. She had written and deleted 17 different messages over the past 3 hours. Text felt too easy to ignore. A letter felt too formal, too much like a business correspondence between strangers who shared an address. It needed to be her voice. He needed to hear what he'd spent 6 years refusing to see. Emily pressed record. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, eyes red-rimmed, mascara smudged, the emerald dress she'd worn for him now feeling like a costume from someone else's life. When she spoke, her voice came out raw and broken, all the polish of 6 years as an alpha's Luna stripped away until only the truth remained. James, it's me. I know you're busy. You're always busy, but I need you to hear this because I can't carry it alone anymore. I've been pregnant for 3 months, 12 weeks of growing our daughter. I know it's a girl somehow. I can feel her, and I couldn't even find 30 seconds where you'd look at me long enough to let me tell you. We're going to have a baby, except it doesn't feel like we anymore, does it? It feels like me. Just me. Alone in this glass tower you built to prove you're nothing like your father, except you've become exactly what he was. Cold. Unreachable. More married to power than to the woman wearing your ring. Her voice cracked and she paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing expensive makeup across her fingers. I thought the mate bond would save us. That's what everyone said, right? That alphas and their Lunas are destined, that the wolves know even when the humans are too stubborn to see it. But I don't think your wolf even recognizes me anymore, James. I think you've buried him so deep under board meetings and hostile takeovers that there's nothing left but the empire. Your father arranged our marriage because a stable Luna makes a strong alpha king because it looked good for the pack, good for business. I believed that maybe eventually you'd see past the politics to the person. But 6 years later, I'm still invisible. I'm still furniture in your museum of success. And I can't be invisible anymore. Not for me, and not for this baby who deserves to know what love looks like instead of cold marble and colder silences. Emily stood, pacing the bathroom, her bare feet cold against the heated floors that James had installed because someone once told him that's what luxury meant. So, I'm leaving. By the time you listen to this, if you ever do, I'll already be gone. Don't look for me, James. Not because I hate you. I don't. I wish I could hate you. It would make this easier. But I can't let our daughter grow up thinking this is what love is. I can't let her watch her mother disappear the way I've watched myself fade. I need to find the girl I was before I became your invisible queen. The one who painted and laughed and believed the world was more than quarterly projections and market shares. I loved you. God, I really loved you. I loved you enough to wait 6 years, hoping you'd love me back. But that's exactly why I have to go. Goodbye, Alpha King. I hope you find whatever you're looking for in those boardrooms. I hope it keeps you warm at night. She hit send before courage could abandon her, before she could talk herself into one more chance, one more year, one more attempt at being perfect enough to earn his attention. The voice note uploaded in seconds. The timestamp read 1:15 a.m. somewhere below. James's phone would buzz. He would swipe it away like he'd swiped away every other attempt she'd made to matter. Emily changed out of the emerald dress, leaving it pooled on the bathroom floor like shed skin. She pulled on jeans she hadn't worn in 3 years. They still fit, barely, and the oversized Yale sweatshirt from her college days when she believed in futures that weren't predetermined by pack politics. She packed a single suitcase, ignoring the walk-in closet full of designer labels and carefully curated outfits that Victoria had helped select. Simple things. Comfortable things. The leather journal she'd been secretly filling with paintings and thoughts for 2 years. 3 sweaters that felt like her. The worn paperback of poetry her mother had given her before the wedding, before everything changed. Her grandmother's bracelet, the only jewelry that mattered. At 2:51 a.m., Emily stood at her bedroom door with her suitcase, listening. James's voice still drifted up from his study, discussing projections and strategies with people who understood his language better than his wife ever had. She walked down the hall, her footsteps silent on carpet that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. She paused outside his study door, her hand hovering near the handle. Inside, she could see him through the crack, positioned at his desk with the city glittering behind him, looking every inch the Alpha King the magazines worshipped. Powerful, untouchable, alone in ways he'd never acknowledge. Emily didn't open the door. She turned and walked to the service elevator, the one the cleaning staff used, the one nobody monitored because invisible people used invisible exits. The taxi was waiting in the parking garage where she'd arranged it, engine running, driver patient, and disinterested in the drama of wealthy people's lives. As they pulled away from the building, Emily looked back once. The penthouse glowed like a beacon against the night sky, beautiful and cold and empty, just like the man she was leaving behind. James woke at 1:47 p.m. to silence, so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He never slept past 7. Never. His internal clock had been calibrated by years of pre-market trading calls and international time zones, his body trained to function on 5 hours of sleep and black coffee and the relentless forward momentum that built empires. But exhaustion had finally claimed him sometime after dawn. Dragging him under like a riptide, he was too tired to fight. He showered with mechanical precision, the hot water doing nothing to wash away the fog in his head. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who looked exactly like success. Sharp jawline, dark hair perfectly styled, even disheveled, eyes that had intimidated boardrooms across 3 continents. He looked like an Alpha King. He felt hollowed out in ways he couldn't name. James dressed in his usual uniform, charcoal Tom Ford suit, white shirt pressed to knife-edge precision, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The ritual of dressing had always centered him, transformed him from whatever doubts existed in the shower into the man who made billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. But today his hands fumbled with the tie, having to restart twice before getting the Windsor knot right. The penthouse felt different as he descended the stairs. Wrong somehow. It took him 3 steps into the kitchen to realize what was missing: the smell of coffee. Emily always had coffee ready by the time he woke, had it timed to his schedule with a precision that would have impressed his executive team. He'd never thanked her for it, had never even acknowledged noticing it, though he'd been drinking her coffee every morning for 6 years. The coffee maker sat cold and empty. James stood staring at it like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve, his mind still sluggish from too little sleep. He pulled out his phone to check the time and saw the notification he'd swiped away hours ago still hovering at the edge of his screen. Emily. A voice message sent at 1:15 a.m., right around the time he'd been dissecting the Nakamura contract with the Tokyo office, finding the weak points, planning his attack. He almost swiped it away again. Almost. But something in the silence of the kitchen stopped him. James pressed play and lifted the phone to his ear. Emily's voice hit him like a physical blow. Raw. Broken. Nothing like the careful, modulated tone she used at pack functions or charity dinners. This was Emily stripped of every defense, every polished surface, and the sound of her crying made something crack in his chest that he'd spent decades building into impenetrable armor. James, it's me. I know you're busy. You're always busy, but I need you to hear this because I can't carry it alone anymore. Pregnant. She was pregnant. 3 months. 12 weeks of carrying his child, and he hadn't noticed, hadn't seen, hadn't stopped moving fast enough to realize the woman he'd married was trying to tell him something that mattered more than any deal, any merger, any triumph his empire could manufacture. I can't let our daughter grow up thinking this is what love is. A daughter. They were having a daughter. I loved you. God, I really loved you. I loved you enough to wait 6 years, hoping you'd love me back. But that's exactly why I have to go. Goodbye, Alpha King. The message ended. James stood frozen in the kitchen, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the silence where Emily's voice had been. His hand was shaking. When had his hand started shaking? He played it again, then again. Each time, Emily's broken voice tore something loose inside him that he didn't know how to repair. The clinical part of his brain, the part that analyzed market trends and calculated risk, was noting details. Past tense. I loved you. Not I love you. The finality in her goodbye. The way she'd called him Alpha King instead of his name, like he'd become a title instead of a man. James walked through the penthouse like he was seeing it for the first time. When had it become so cold? He climbed the stairs to Emily's bedroom. When had he started thinking of it as her bedroom instead of theirs, and pushed open the door. The closet was half empty. Not dramatically so, not ransacked or destroyed, just diminished. The designer gowns still hung in neat rows. The jewelry he'd given her still sat in velvet boxes, but the spaces between were wrong. The jeans she'd worn on weekends were gone. The oversized sweatshirts she'd curl up in were missing. The worn leather journal she thought he didn't know about had vanished from the drawer where she'd hidden it beneath silk scarves. Emily hadn't taken the expensive things. She'd taken herself. James sank onto the edge of her bed, still holding his phone, and played the message one more time. This time he heard what he'd been too blind to see for 6 years. She'd been drowning right in front of him, and he'd walked past her every single day to answer another call, close another deal, build another floor on an empire that meant absolutely nothing if she wasn't in it. His wolf, silent and buried for so long beneath strategy and ambition, finally stirred in his chest. And it was howling. Victoria arrived at 3 p.m. with her tablet and efficient smile, ready to review the day's collapse schedule. She found James standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, still wearing yesterday's suit, looking at the city like he'd never seen it before. Mr. Milner, the Tokyo office has been trying to reach you for 6 hours. The Nakamura deal is waiting on your signature, and the board has called an emergency meeting for. You're fired. The words came out flat, emotionless, nothing like the sharp commands Victoria had learned to anticipate and execute. She blinked, tablet lowering slightly. I'm sorry. You're fired, Victoria. Effective immediately. Severance will be generous. 6 months' salary, full benefits, excellent references. But I need you to leave. Victoria's professional composure cracked for the first time in 4 years. James, if this is about the Singapore contracts, I can explain the delay. It's not about the contracts. James turned to face her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her take a step back. It's about the fact that you knew more about my wife's daily life than I did. That you managed her schedule, picked her clothes, remembered her preferences while I treated her like an appointment I could reschedule. You did your job perfectly, Victoria. Too perfectly. You helped me build an empire while my marriage died, and I let you because it was easier than facing what I was becoming. He pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. He'd written the termination letter an hour ago, his handwriting barely legible through the shaking. I don't blame you. I blame myself. But I can't rebuild anything with you still here, reminding me of who I was. Victoria took the envelope with trembling hands. Where will you go? To find my wife. To become someone who deserves her. After Victoria left, James called an emergency board meeting. 15 men and women who'd built fortunes alongside him assembled virtually within the hour, their faces filling screens around his study, with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed irritation. Gentlemen, ladies, I'm canceling the Nakamura merger. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before erupting into overlapping protests. James let them rage, watching their mouths move, hearing the words he'd spent 20 years learning to speak: fiduciary responsibility, shareholder value, market positioning. The language of empires built on sacrificing everything that mattered for everything that didn't. James, this deal represents 18 months of negotiations. $3 billion in projected revenue. You'll tank the stock price. Are you having some kind of breakdown? James waited until they ran out of breath, out of arguments, out of ways to tell him he was destroying everything he'd built. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha king who'd finally remembered what power was actually for. My wife left me. She's pregnant with my daughter, and she left because I was so obsessed with building this empire that I forgot empires mean nothing if you're ruling them alone. The Nakamura merger would have required 6 months of my life. 6 months I don't have to waste anymore. Some things are more important than money. I'm sorry it took me 6 years and losing everything to figure that out. He looked at each face on the screens, these people who'd helped him become a man he no longer wanted to be. I'm stepping down as CEO. Promote Richardson. He's hungry enough and ruthless enough to do what needs doing. I'll retain my shares, but I'm done running this company like it's the only thing that matters. Because it's not. It never was. James closed the laptop before anyone could respond. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered in the afternoon sun. Beautiful and indifferent, a city that would keep running whether he was conquering it or not. He had a wife to find, a daughter to meet, a man to become who was worthy of the second chance he probably didn't deserve. The Alpha King was dead. Now he had to figure out how to be just James. It took James 3 days to find her. 3 days of hiring investigators who actually cared about discretion, of tracking credit card transactions to a small coastal town in Oregon called Seabrook, of driving 16 hours straight in a rental car because commercial flights felt too slow and private jets felt too much like the man he was trying to stop being. He arrived looking nothing like an alpha king. 4 days of stubble darkened his jaw, his hair was unkempt from running his hands through it too many times, and the jeans and plain black Henley he'd bought at a rest stop somewhere in Northern California hung on a frame that had lost weight he didn't have to spare. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, hadn't answered his phone in 72 hours. His wolf was clawing at his chest, desperate and frantic in ways James had never allowed it to be. The address led him to a cottage perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, weathered gray shingles and white trim that looked like it had stood there for 100 years watching the ocean. It was small, laughably small compared to the penthouse, but it had something the glass tower never did. It looked like a home. James sat in the rental car for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to find words that wouldn't sound hollow or desperate or like promises from a man who'd broken every promise that mattered. Through the windshield, he could see a small garden plot beside the cottage, freshly turned earth dark and rich against the coastal grass. And there she was. Emily knelt in the dirt, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing clothes he'd never seen her in, faded overalls and a white t-shirt, dirt smudged across her cheek. She was planting something, her movements careful and deliberate, pressing seeds into soil with hands that had once worn designer gloves to charity galas. The curve of her stomach was visible now beneath the denim, the swell of their daughter unmistakable. She looked more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, backlit by afternoon sun, creating something that would grow instead of just existing in the sterile perfection he'd demanded. James got out of the car. The sound of the door closing made Emily look up, her hands stilling in the earth. For a moment, neither of them moved. The ocean crashed against the cliffs below, seagulls called overhead, and James felt like he was standing at the edge of everything that mattered with no idea how to stop himself from falling. Emily. Her name came out rough, broken by exhaustion and fear and the terrible understanding of everything he'd lost. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, her green eyes unreadable as she looked at the man who used to be her husband. James could see the wariness in her posture, the way she angled herself toward the cottage door like she might need to run. From him. She needed an escape route from him. You shouldn't have come, James. Her voice was quiet, lacking the raw emotion from the voice message, but carrying something worse, resignation. Like she'd already grieved him and moved on to the complicated work of rebuilding herself from the ruins. I know. James took 2 steps forward, then stopped when he saw her tense. I know I shouldn't have. I know I don't deserve to be here, that I destroyed every right I had to stand on your doorstep and ask for anything. But I needed to see you, to tell you that I heard every word you said in that message. Every single word, Emily, and you were right about all of it. Hearing it isn't enough. Emily's hand moved to her stomach, protective, maternal in ways that made James's chest ache. I've heard you say a lot of things over 6 years, James. You're very good with words when you need to be. It's the actions that never matched. I fired Victoria, stepped down as CEO, canceled the Nakamura merger. James heard how pathetic it sounded, listing achievements like they meant something when the only achievement that mattered was standing 20 feet away looking at him like he was a stranger. I'm not telling you this to impress you or prove anything. I'm telling you because I'm trying to show you that I meant what I said. That I'm done being the alpha king who had everything except what mattered. Emily was quiet for a long moment, the wind catching her hair, pulling strands loose from the bun. She looked at the garden she was planting, then back at James. There's a motel in town. The Seabrook Inn. You should stay there tonight. She turned back toward her cottage, her home, the life she was building without him. I need time to think, James. Time you never gave me in New York. If you really want to prove you've changed, then prove you can give me that. She walked inside and closed the door. Not slammed, just closed. Gentle and final, and somehow worse than any explosion of anger could have been. James stood in the garden she was creating, surrounded by the beauty he'd never let her have, and realized that finding her was only the beginning. Now came the impossible part, becoming someone who deserved to stay. The Seabrook Marina hired James on a Tuesday morning after the owner, a weathered man named Cal who looked like he'd spent 60 years arguing with the ocean, asked him exactly one question. You afraid of hard work? James, who hadn't done manual labor since a single summer during college before his father had pulled strings to get him a corner office internship, said no. Cal handed him a scrub brush, a bucket of industrial cleaner that smelled like it could strip paint, and pointed at 40 boats that needed their decks cleaned before tourist season. $6 above minimum wage. Cash at the end of each day. You show up on time, work hard, don't complain. We got a deal? It was the most honest transaction James had made in 20 years. He scrubbed decks until his hands blistered and bled through the cheap work gloves he'd bought at the hardware store. He hauled dock lines and sanded teak and learned the names of knots he'd never needed to know when people did everything for him. The work was mindless and endless and exactly what he needed. Hours where his body was too exhausted to think about anything except the next section of deck, the next boat, the next task that had a clear beginning and end. Kel never asked why a man who clearly wasn't local was scrubbing barnacles off hulls for cash. The marina became James's monastery, the physical labor his penance, each blister a small payment on a debt he'd never finish repaying. 3 mornings a week, James drove 40 minutes to a therapist's office in the next town over. Dr. Sarah Chun was 62, had kind eyes and zero tolerance for self-pity, and she didn't care that he'd built a $15 billion empire. She cared that his father had beaten the humanity out of him one business lesson at a time, teaching him that vulnerability was weakness and love was a liability. Your father was an alpha who confused dominance with strength, Dr. Chun said during their 3rd session while James sat with his blistered hands folded in his lap. And you spent your entire adult life trying to prove you weren't weak by becoming exactly what destroyed him. Isolated, cruel, powerful, and completely alone. James learned to sit with the discomfort of being seen. Learned that the panic he felt when he wasn't working was actually grief he'd been outrunning since he was 12 years old. Learned that his wolf had gone silent not because he was strong, but because he'd been slowly suffocating everything that made him human. Every morning before his shift at the marina, James walked to Emily's cottage and left wildflowers on her porch. Not expensive arrangements from florists, but handfuls of coastal blooms he picked from the cliffs, Indian paintbrush, sea thrift, wild lupin. Flowers that grew in harsh conditions and somehow stayed beautiful. He never knocked, never left notes. Just flowers and the silent message that he was still here, still trying, still becoming someone who might deserve a second chance. Some mornings he'd see her through the window, moving around the kitchen with that careful grace, her hand resting on her growing belly. Once, he watched her pick up the wildflowers and press them to her face, breathing them in. She stood there for a long moment before carrying them inside. James allowed himself to hope. On Friday nights, he attended a men's group at the community center, former addicts and divorced fathers and veterans trying to piece themselves back together. Nobody knew he used to be an alpha king. They knew him as James, the guy who scrubbed boats and didn't talk much, but always showed up and listened when other men shared the ways they'd failed the people they loved. I treated her like an acquisition, James said one night, 6 weeks into his new life, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been healing. Like if I'd just maintained her properly, kept her in the right setting, she'd appreciate and value. I never saw her as a person who needed to be loved, not managed. An older man named Frank, who'd lost his wife to his alcoholism 15 years ago, nodded slowly. The hardest part ain't admitting what you did wrong. It's accepting that knowing better doesn't mean she has to forgive you. You're doing the work for you now, son. Whether she comes back or not. James went home to his motel room that night and cried for the first time in 23 years. His wolf, slowly waking from its long sleep, finally howled its grief into the darkness. And somewhere across town, in a cottage on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, Emily stood on her porch holding a bundle of wildflowers, wondering if a man could truly change or if she was just desperate enough to believe in miracles. Emily called him on a Wednesday morning, 3 months after he'd arrived in Seabrook with nothing but desperation and a rental car. James was at the marina, varnishing the rails on a 40-foot sailboat, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost didn't answer. He'd learned to let the world wait while he finished what he'd started, but something made him pull off his gloves and check the screen. I have an ultrasound appointment tomorrow at 10, Emily said without preamble. At the clinic in town. I thought you might want to be there. James's hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the phone.
Yes.
I'll be there. James. Her voice softened slightly, losing some of its careful distance. This doesn't mean everything is fixed. It just means you've shown up long enough that I believe you're trying. I know. Thank you for letting me try. The Seabrook Medical Clinic was nothing like the pristine Manhattan facilities where James had imagined such moments happening, back when he'd bothered to imagine them at all. It was a small building with worn linoleum and chairs that didn't match, where the receptionist knew everyone by name and the coffee was terrible but free. Emily sat in the waiting room wearing a loose blue dress, her hand resting on her belly, which had grown considerably in 3 months. She looked up when James walked in, still in his work clothes because he'd been too afraid of being late to stop and change. He probably smelled like varnish and ocean and honest work. She didn't seem to mind. Hi, he said, suddenly feeling like a teenager on a first date instead of a 41-year-old man who'd built empires. Emily gestured to the seat beside her. Your hands are bleeding again. James looked down at his palms, where fresh blisters had cracked open. Comes with the job. You could wear better gloves. I could. He sat down carefully, leaving space between them that felt both respectful and heartbreaking. But I think I need to feel it. Need to remember that everything worth having costs something real. The ultrasound technician called them back before Emily could respond. The exam room was small and dim, the equipment humming quietly as Emily laid back on the table and lifted her dress to expose her belly. James stood frozen near the door until Emily looked at him and nodded toward the chair beside the exam table. You can come closer. She won't bite. James moved to the chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. I had them tell me at the last appointment. I wanted to know who I was talking to when I talked to her at night. The technician spread cold gel across Emily's stomach and pressed the transducer against her skin. The monitor flickered to life, and suddenly there she was, their daughter, moving and real, her tiny heart beating like a hummingbird's wings, her perfect profile visible as she turned in the darkness that had been her whole world. James stopped breathing, stopped thinking, stopped being anything except a father seeing his child for the first time and understanding with absolute clarity that he had almost missed this. Had almost traded this miracle for quarterly reports and market dominance and the hollow satisfaction of being feared instead of loved. Everything looks perfect, the technician said, pointing out tiny hands and feet, the curve of her spine, the chambers of her heart. She's measuring right on schedule. About 28 weeks. Due in early March. Emily was watching James instead of the screen. He didn't realize he was crying until she reached out and took his hand, his rough, blistered, worker's hand, and held it against her belly where their daughter was turning somersaults in the safe darkness. Her name is Grace, Emily said softly. I've been calling her Grace because that's what she is. Unearned and freely given, and the only thing that could save us. James couldn't speak past the stone lodged in his throat, so he just nodded and kept his hand pressed to Emily's belly, feeling Grace move beneath his palm, feeling the miracle of second chances made flesh. They sat in Emily's car in the parking lot afterward, neither of them moving to start the engine. The ocean was visible from here, gray and restless under October clouds. Finally, Emily spoke. I'm not ready to come back to New York. I don't think I ever will be. That penthouse was a beautiful cage, James, and I can't go back to being what I was there. Then we stay here. James said it without hesitation, without calculation, without weighing costs against benefits. I'll buy the cottage if it's a rental. Or we'll find another one. I don't care where we live as long as it's together. As long as Grace grows up knowing her father chose her over everything else. Emily was quiet, studying his face like she was reading a language she'd almost forgotten. You really mean that? You'd give up Manhattan, the company, all of it, to scrub boats and live in a cottage by the ocean. I'd give up everything I have for a chance at everything I need. James reached for her hand, then stopped, waiting for permission. Emily offered it, sliding her fingers between his. The greatest empire I ever built was the one I destroyed by ignoring it. You and Grace, that's the only success that matters. That's the only legacy worth leaving. Emily leaned her head back against the seat, tears sliding down her cheeks. I'm still scared. Scared that you'll wake up one day and resent me for making you small, for taking away your throne. You didn't make me small, Emily. You reminded me how to be human, how to be real. James brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence he'd never shown anything in his life. I spent 41 years building an alpha king that everyone feared. I'd like to spend the rest of my life building a man that you and Grace can love. If you'll let me. The ocean crashed against the cliffs. Seagulls called overhead. And in the parking lot of a small-town clinic, Emily Milner decided to believe in miracles one more time. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, please like the video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly means the world to me and helps this channel grow. Thank you for being here.